So session 4, workflow triggers. So the agenda for today, what we're going to be covering are basically 4 things. And it's kind of like what we did yesterday with workflow actions, where we're going to break these down into different categories. We're not going to necessarily go from top to bottom. We're just going to group them into categories that make a lot of sense. And I think this will help the information stick a little bit better because you're grouping them into certain pockets instead of just learning one after another in sort of a random order. So the first one that, or the first key that I want to talk about here before we even get into the triggers is that workflow triggers allow your process to actually have automation. If you don't have triggers built into your workflow, then there's no structure. There's no control over what you want to do. So in my opinion, learning these triggers inside and out will enhance your workflow capabilities immensely. When I've worked with people in the past, when I've done one-on-one sessions with people, when I've done setups for people, all of these different things, the more that somebody knows how triggers work, the better their workflows are going to be. Triggers, if you can really understand what each one does, it allows for so much more creative capability. And when we build the workflow next week, you're going to see why, oh, if I understand triggers, there's so much more that I can do than if I just know them kind of well, but I might know the action. So it's very, very important if you want to be very skilled in developing workflows. Understanding the triggers is going to be the biggest factor. So let's get into it here. So I have a little picture, and I want to kind of explain to you why it's so important to understand what workflow triggers are. So I have 2 pictures here. One, you can see I have a 4-way stop here, but just imagine for a second, you have all of these cars here and they're all coming to an intersection, but there's no traffic light or there's no traffic sign. So if this scenario were to play out, what's going to happen? There's going to be a car crash because there's nothing that is telling which cars need to go or which ones need to stop or which ones need to yield. And so the reason that workflow triggers are so important is because the actions that you have, so when you're setting up send form, send email, send appointment scheduler, create to do, when you're developing all of those workflow actions, that's like having cars going at a 4-way stop. But if you don't have traffic lights there, then it's just going to run into each other. There's going to be traffic jams and everything like that. Your traffic lights are your workflow triggers. So when you combine these things, it's going to make it more of a safe environment when you're actually going through and building your workflow. If you don't know what each color means on a traffic light, or you don't know when lights should change, you're going to cause what I call a workflow accident. I know that's kind of corny, but you can understand why it's so important to understand what triggers actually do. And when you're thinking about this from a business perspective, the last thing you want are things to fire when you don't really want them to. I've talked to a lot of people on one-on-one sessions, and they'll start with this fired and I don't know why. And I can tell you that 90% of the time it all comes back to they didn't really understand how triggers work. And so things fired when they weren't supposed to. And if they would have just adjusted a few things, then everything would have been fine. They had their workflow actions right. All of that was good. They had send form with the intake questionnaire. They had the email in there with the form link. Everything was perfect, but just because they got the trigger wrong, everything went haywire. So that's why it's so important to understand what triggers do, when to use them properly, and things like that. So hopefully that will kind of set in why it's so important to know the workflow triggers. And just like traffic lights, you probably don't want everything to be green all the time. You don't want things just to be completely automated going all the time. You need to know when to stop or slow your workflow. And that's if you want to put approve buttons on there or create to-dos. Maybe there are situations where you need to pause your workflow and stop everything. So that is another kind of correlation on why workflow triggers can be compared to kind of traffic lights in that scenario. So the first group that we're going to talk about, again, to me, are probably the most important ones because they have to do with client progress. When a client completes something or makes a payment or signs a contract, all of those types of things, which is going to be primarily what you're going to use, I want to start with that group here. So the first ones we're going to start off with are after form is completed or is not completed. And I'm not going to do these separate because technically they follow the same logic. It just depends on if it is completed or if it's not completed. So we're just going to group this here together. So these two triggers are relative to when a specific form that's already sent through the workflow is submitted by the client. And there's a couple things that are really important with these two triggers. Number one is that the form needs to be sent through the workflow in order to use this trigger or these two triggers. So we'll get into that in just a second. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but the three forms, and this ties into what we talked about yesterday. When you're using send form in a workflow, there's three forms that ties into: questionnaires, proposals, and sub-agreements. So if you're using send form as an action to send those three different types of forms, after form completed or is not completed is kind of the trigger to that action, where you can only watch for questionnaires, proposals, and sub-agreements to either get completed or not completed. So that's what's really important about this particular or these two particular triggers. So in Dubsado, let's pop over here and let's actually look at this in real time so we can understand what's going on here. So when you have in the workflow, so remember, it has to be in the workflow. I'm sending out an intake questionnaire in the workflow. So my next action, let's say I send out an intake questionnaire, and then as soon as they complete that questionnaire, I want to now send out my 30-minute consultation. So in this second action that I have here, if I open it up, right here in the when section, this is going to be where we kind of break down and talk about the formula for when this is going to go out to the client. So actually, before I deep dive into that, there is one thing that I want to talk about, and that's just the formula for how to build this. I actually don't have it in the outline, but I'll kind of talk about this when section and some of your options here. So when you're building this workflow action, and we talked about actions yesterday, this when section, basically what you're going to do is put together a formula for when this action is actually going to happen. You're programming that in. If you remember from the second session, when we talked about when you're writing out your process, how important it is to be detailed on when you want something to happen, you can't just say, oh, I want to send this a few days later, or I want to send this a couple of weeks later. You need to say, I want to send this 24 hours, or I want to send this 3 days after. You have to be very intentional about the time, because when you're putting together a workflow trigger, you are actually, as you can see here, designating, an hour, 3 hours, if you want to do days, if you want to put in a decimal. Some people don't know you can do this, but you could say 3.5 days if you want to, and say 3.5 days after. You could do something like that. But when you are deciding your when, you need to be very specific. And once you've kind of picked your time frame on, 1 day or 1 hour, 1 year after, whatever it is that you want to do, now you're going to choose from this list of the different triggers that you can actually put in there. So we're looking at after form is completed. That's the one we're looking at here. And once we do this, so let's say we put in 0. Another thing to know here is that whenever you have 0 in there, that means immediately. It doesn't matter if you have 0 years, if you want to. I've never seen anybody do that. But if you do 0 years, that still means immediately. So regardless of what this is right here, it will always mean immediately if there's a 0 there. So we'll just do 0 days. That's kind of typical there. But what's important about this trigger here is this option right here. If you're doing after form is completed or after form is not completed, either one, it's going to ask you right here, which form are we going to watch to make sure that that gets filled out? You have to tell the workflow which form we're looking at. It's not just going to know because you put in after form is completed. You have to designate which one it's going to watch specifically. When I click this drop down, it's going to show me all of the forms. And again, I'm going to tie this back in. Forms mean questionnaires, proposals, or sub-agreements. So even if I have a contract going out in here, that's not going to show up in this list, or a lead capture form. We'll get to that in a second. But it's only those 3 types of forms that are being sent in the workflow. And right now, as you can see over here, all I have is my intake questionnaire. So that's the only thing that's going to pop up in this list. So I can click this, and it's specifically going to watch whenever I send this out to a client. It's going to say, you know, immediately after, or whenever this is, it's going, once they complete it, it's going to send out whatever I've designated down here. And we talked about picking the content you want first, and then the email that goes with that. We got all into that yesterday, so I won't have to rehash that. But that's going to be how you use this trigger effectively. Now, another thing that I will always see, I just want to double check here. Yeah, we can move forward onto this slide, is a lot of people are normally trying to use this to watch when a lead capture form gets completed. But if you kind of think about the logic behind this, I'm going to use this graph. We kind of looked at this on the first session, but if I have a lead capture form that is outside of Dubsado, what I mean by outside is that it's not inside the system as far as where it's placed. That lead capture form is embedded on a website, or it's put on Instagram, or it's on Facebook. It's outside of Dubsado. So if you have a workflow in here and you're watching for once a form gets completed, it can't look and see this lead capture form that's technically outside of the system. I know that's kind of weird to think about outside, but whenever I say outside, I just mean it's not within Dubsado, it's on your website, or it's someplace outside of the system. So when that happens, as you can kind of see down here, and actually what I'll do, let me just do this in the actual, model here. So I'm just going to remove this. And here's what happens. So I'm going to take this workflow, and let's say I put it on a lead capture form. What I'm thinking theoretically is when they fill out that lead capture form, that's going to then be my action and trigger that I want, is once they complete that lead capture form. But if I come in here and let's say I do send appointment scheduler, and now if I were to choose immediately after a form is completed, and thinking about it logically, that makes sense because it's a lead capture form. So you're thinking about it in that context. But if you just remember when we talked about send form yesterday, questionnaires, sub-agreements, proposals, those are the only 3 that it works with. This is what you're going to get here. It says no forms have been added to the workflow yet. So that's the second point that I really want to drive home, is you can only use after form is completed or not completed if it's going out inside of that workflow. So that's very important to know when you're building your workflows there. And that's, like I said, that's a common issue that I typically see. So after form is not completed, I want to talk about that for a second. Let me open up an example that I have here just so you can see in practice. And I think this is really going to spark some creativity for a lot of you to see some of these things in practice. You're going to see it a lot more next week when we actually build out the workflow, but we'll kind of talk through this here. So let's say the very first thing that I'm going to do in my workflow is send out my catering proposal to a client. And so let's just pretend, for example, I have my proposal, contract, and invoice all going out in that first action. We talked about that yesterday. So once that goes out to the client, if I want to use after form is not completed, I can, because it's a proposal, and that falls in one of those 3 forms. So anytime you're using that trigger, or you want to use that trigger, the first barometer is it a questionnaire, sub-agreement, or proposal? Yep, it is. Okay, second thing, is it going out inside of the workflow as an action? Yep, it is. So now I can use it, and now I have some ammunition that I can play with. So I want to kind of break down what I'm going to do here, but I have it set up where if it's not completed in 3 days, I want to resend the proposal out to the client. So let me dive into this action so that you really can see what the logic is behind this. So right here, this is what we were talking about earlier, is this section right here. So I have 3 days after form is not completed, and I'm watching for my catering proposal to be not completed, basically. Once I send this to the client, it's going to be 3 days. If they haven't filled it out after 3 days, then I want to do something. So because it's in the workflow, I can watch for it, okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use send form as my action. I could use send email. That's totally fine. If you want to use send email, that will absolutely work. The only thing is, if you remember from yesterday, if you use send email as your action, you can't include a proposal in that body of the email, because if you add a form link, it's not going to be tied to anything because you're using send email. If you use send form, now what you can actually do down here towards the bottom of the email is you can say, hey, I've noticed you've not submitted your proposal yet. If you're still unsure and have any questions or want to make any changes, please send me an email so we can discuss. Now what I've done instead is I've said I want to resend. I'm picking that catering proposal again, and that's going to plug in right here on that form link. Like I said, send email will work, but you would basically need to tell them in that email, go back to the original email that I sent and then click on the link, which that's not very good for the client experience. So the best way to do this so that it works really well for you is to do send form, and then just make sure in the body here, you're including that form link, and then you can choose this. Another thing to pay attention to is that when we're talking about forms in Dubsado, proposals, questionnaires, sub-agreements, I'm going to keep saying it because I think that will help it sink in, is that if you choose this proposal again from this list, so I'm choosing my catering proposal, how forms work in Dubsado when it comes to workflows is that it's going to send the exact same copy out to the client. This is not going to send out a new template. It's going to be the exact same one that you originally sent out. That's how forms work in Dubsado whenever you're using workflows. So I don't have to worry if I use this action that it's going to send out a new copy. It'll be the exact same form that goes out. So that's how that works there. So because of that reason, I can have something here that says send catering proposal if the catering proposal is not completed in 3 days. Send the catering proposal again if it's not completed in a week. So now I have 2 reminders going out. This is so helpful because now I don't need to even monitor if they filled out the proposal or not. This is literally watching for if they fill it out. If they don't, it's going to send that email out automatically. Could, at this point, I put in an approval button? Absolutely. You don't have to set it up where it's automated. If you want to put an approval button on here, what's going to happen is 3 days, if they don't fill out that proposal, it's going to send you an email and say, hey, do you want to send out this follow-up? Now, they haven't filled it out, so you don't need to check on that, but maybe you want to edit this email in here and maybe put something in there. You could do that if you want to, but most of the time, you don't even really need an approval. If you have sort of just a generic email in there, then that will just be a good primer and reminder for them to fill out the proposal. The last thing I have on here is I want to archive the project if they don't fill it out after 14 days. So let's think about this from a business perspective. If I send out a proposal to a client and they're getting the pricing, contract, invoice, all that's getting sent out to them, they're still considered a lead at this point. They haven't signed with me. They haven't paid an invoice. I'm still thinking of them as a lead. So if they don't fill this out after 2 weeks, I'm just going to archive this project because my assumption is that they're not moving forward. Now, something that I know people are probably thinking is, well, what happens if they go to that proposal after I archive the project and they submit it, let's say after 3 weeks? You're going to get an email that says so-and-so has completed your proposal or signed the contract or whatever the case may be. So you'll still get that email. What you would need to do is go into your archived projects and just unarchive it and then restart the workflow. That's how you would manage that. But that's just a good idea. And what this will do for you, this last action here, and you could use this with a questionnaire if you wanted to. So let's say there's like an intake questionnaire that you want people to fill out right away. You could send that out to them. And if they don't fill it out after a week or after 2 weeks, you can just archive that lead. And that's going to keep your leads list extremely fresh. You're not going to have all these leads that are backed up and they've had proposals out there for 3 months. It's going to remove them off of that leads list and just archive the project. You don't have to do 14 days. If you wanted to say, 21 days or 3 weeks or give them a month to do it, you can determine the time there. But that's just a good example of how you can use after form is not completed to your advantage. As long as it's one of those 3 forms and it's going out in an action in the workflow, you can basically do whatever you want to at that point. If you want to create tasks for yourself, if they don't complete it, if you want to, I don't know what something else that you would do besides create a task or send it again, but that's basically what you can do there. So those are those 2 actions, or those 2 triggers, after form is completed or not completed. Okay, after a contract is signed by client. This one is really straightforward. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because it's pretty much once they've signed the contract, I want this particular thing to happen. So it's all relative to when the contract on the project is signed. Now remember, this is actually the main contract on the project. So this has nothing to do with sub-agreements. If you're wanting to watch for a sub-agreement to get approved, or once they sign a sub-agreement, you would use send form and after form is completed, because sub-agreements fall into that form category. So contract signed by client is your main terms and conditions contract. If you have a proposal contract and invoice together, you could have it do something once they sign that contract if you want to. The other thing that's really important about this trigger is that this has nothing to do with counter signatures. So if you're sending out a contract that has a space for you to sign as a business owner, that trigger is going to get activated by the client signing the contract, not once you've countersigned it. You would have to kind of manipulate your workflow a little bit. Like you could do something like hold actions until the contract is signed by client, then put a to-do underneath there to countersign the contract. And then maybe once you select that to-do that you've gotten that finished, then maybe after that something could happen. So that way you're making sure there's a task in there that you can countersign the contract and then send out that next action if you want it to be after a counter signature. But that trigger is only watching for the client to sign, not waiting for a counter signature also. So that's how after contract is signed works. I don't believe that I have anything in here. Oh, I do actually. So let me open this up and we'll talk through this. So let's pretend for an example, I know yesterday I said you don't need to do this, but it is a really good example for maybe somebody who wants to send out a proposal by itself first, then send out a contract by itself, and then an invoice by itself. So in this scenario, let's just pretend, for example, that I want to send them all out separately. There's actually people I've talked to who work with people who aren't really good with technology, and it makes more sense to actually send it out individually because it's more easier for them to handle. So if you, let's say this is only the proposal. So if I'm sending out this proposal here, then what I want to do is I want to send out my contract after the catering proposal is completed. So I'm specifically watching for, okay, they filled out the proposal. Only once that proposal has been completed do I want the contract to go out. And then Once the contract gets signed, now I want to send out the invoice that got created. So this is where you can break it down into 3 if you really want to. But in this particular scenario here, I'm very specific on only once they fill out the form and then only once they sign the contract do I want the invoice to go out. And we're going to talk about after all previous actions are complete towards the end. I think it's the last one we talk about. And I have something special for that. So, but that's how contract signed, how you can use that effectively is only send out the invoice maybe after they sign the contract there. Okay, next one, after invoice is paid in full. Again, this one is really basic, really simple. There's not a lot to this one, but it's basically relative to when the primary invoice on the project gets paid in full. So there's 2 important things with this trigger. One, it's the primary invoice that it's looking for. It's not looking at all of these other invoices. We talked about primary invoices in detail yesterday. So if you do have more questions about what is a primary invoice, how does it work, review the lesson from yesterday because I deep dived into that specific thing. But it's always going to watch the primary invoice. Once that invoice gets paid in full, it's going to trigger that action that you have set up there. The other thing that's very important to pay attention to is that if you apply a payment manually to the invoice, it's still going to activate that trigger. A lot of people have that question when I talk to them on the phone or when I do other webinars. And what people are worried about is that in order for that workflow to trigger that action, it has to be where they're paying through Stripe, Square, or PayPal, and it all has to be done automatically for that workflow trigger to fire. But the way our workflow is set up is it's actually just looking at this invoice. The moment that this gets fulfilled and the payment is in there. So if you come in and say, I want to apply payment here, and it's going to be the full amount, and I plug in the manual payment for this if they pay me in cash, it's still going to activate that trigger. All it's looking for is an equal balance and the invoice is balanced out, and it's going to trigger that action. So that is a plus if you are worried about, well, what happens if I apply payments manually? Is it still going to fire? It definitely will, but it's looking for that entire invoice to get paid in full, and then you can have it trigger. Next one. This one is really interesting because we do get this question a lot. And that is, how can I have something trigger if they're only making a partial payment? I don't want it to be once they pay the entire invoice in full. I want it to be once they pay a deposit or once they pay a certain amount. So this is going to be relative to when a specific scheduled payment is paid on the primary invoice. A really good tip for this, because people, it's kind of tough because it's not even available unless you do something. But if I go into a workflow here, let's open this up. And let's say that I want to send out an email to the client once they pay a deposit. What's tough about this is if you click on this list here, you'll see that there is no after scheduled payment is completed trigger. That is not even in this list. So it throws a lot of people off because they say, how am I supposed to say once they make a certain payment? This is actually a hidden trigger until you add a payment schedule up here at the top of the workflow. So you'll see this list here and there is no after scheduled payment is completed, because there's nothing for the workflow to watch for. So what happens is if I go into this payment schedule area at the top, and let's say I add in a 50-50 payment schedule. Now, if I go back into the workflow and I click this trigger list, now you're going to see that a new one has appeared. So if you don't have a workflow that has a payment schedule in it, it's not going to even show you this trigger, which is kind of tricky if you're not familiar with how this works. So always make sure you have a payment schedule you want it to follow first, and then it will give you this trigger. So once you've added that payment schedule in there, here's what happens. It's very similar to like after form is completed, after the scheduling triggers that we have. We'll get to those next. But If I click on after scheduled payment is completed now, and let's say I do immediately after a scheduled payment is completed, it's going to ask you, which payment are we watching for? The workflow is going to look at that payment schedule, and it can see that there's 2 payments that go with this payment schedule. Here's my deposit, my first 50%, and this one down here is my second 50%. So now I'm just choosing when I want this action to happen based off of which payment. So if I do this first one, this right here is looking for once they pay that 50% deposit. Once they pay that, I could say, okay, let me send out an email, and maybe what I want to do is send out my portal welcome onboarding email. So what this combination is right here is immediately after they pay their deposit, now I want to send an email out, and I'm going to send out my portal instructions to the client because they paid that deposit. So that's how you can use the triggers to watch for a specific payment. But what's most important about this is you have to have the payment schedule here. And you also want to make sure that your payment schedule is set to the exact thing that you want, because the workflow can only read whatever payments are a part of that payment schedule. So if this doesn't look right, you need to go back to your payment schedule and tighten those things up and then come into your workflow. This is another reason why having everything built beforehand is so important, because if I didn't have this 50-50 payment schedule built, if I come into the workflow and I'm saying, okay, after they sign the contract and pay their deposit, I want this to happen, but then I realize I don't even have a payment schedule. Now I have to go back, build my payment schedule, then come back to the workflow. So that's another reason why it's so important to have this set up ahead of time. So that's after scheduled payment is completed. Manually applied payments will still activate this trigger. So let's say you have an invoice for $1,000 and you have a 50-50 on there. If someone gives you $500 in cash and you go to your invoice and manually apply that $500 onto the invoice, it's still going to trigger that action that you have set up. So manually applied payments will still work. This trigger does not watch any invoices created with the create invoice action. Let me explain what that looks like in reality in a workflow. If I go back to my create invoice action, we talked about this yesterday, and once a workflow gets applied into a project, this is going to create an invoice right away, a blank invoice with a 50-50 payment schedule on there. The reason it does that is because it's waiting for a proposal, or maybe you're adding line items manually. It's waiting for something to get added to that invoice. So it's going to be a blank invoice with that 50-50 payment schedule. If I have this first action set for create invoice, it's going to make another invoice. And when I click edit on here, we talked about this yesterday, you can also have a payment schedule on this create invoice action. But if I have this set for 34, 33, 33, and this is technically my second invoice that's getting created, which this is not good practice. You usually do not want this to happen. But just so you understand what's happening here, if I have a 34, 33, 33 on this second invoice that's getting created, and I go here to add an action after scheduled payment is completed, it's only going to see my 50-50. It's not going to read that 3 payment structure that I have in this action. So that's very important. If you do have create invoice in there, it cannot read something that's happening in this action here. Actually, let me highlight that here. In this action, it's not reading that. It's only reading this payment schedule. So that's really important if you are using that create invoice action, just to know the scheduled payment completed trigger cannot look at this action here. So that's how that works. There's not too much more to it. Just as long as you understand those basics, that's all that really applies to that. Okay, scheduled appointments. So now we're going to look at all of the appointment triggers that we have. So I'm grouping all of these together. I'm not going to go through every single one individually because they all pretty much make sense. After appointment is scheduled is once they book on a Dubsado scheduler. Before an appointment start time is once they've booked on that scheduler, it's looking at the specific time they booked so you can send something out beforehand. And then after appointment has ended is looking at that appointment. Once it's over, you can have something happen at that point. So that's basically what those 3 triggers are. They're pretty self-explanatory, but I did want to just break that down really quickly here all in one slide. Now, when you're thinking about forms and schedulers, and if you remember from yesterday, those 2 things function a lot alike, where you can have multiple forms on a workflow or on a project, so you can't send out multiples in an action, or schedulers work the exact same way. They also work the same way when it comes to the triggers. So similar to after form is or is not completed, these workflow triggers can only watch scheduler templates that are being sent inside of the workflow. So when I go into, let me pop this open here. When I go into this scenario here, it works the exact same as if you're doing form completed. Send appointment scheduler. So I'm sending out my 30-minute consultation inside of the workflow. So now my workflow can watch this scheduler. It can watch whenever they book something. If I want to send out something before their appointment or afterwards, now I can do that because it's inside of my workflow. So here's what I have set up. I'm sending out my consultation to them. Now I want to send out an intake questionnaire to them immediately after the appointment is scheduled. When I open this up here, and let's say I choose after appointment is scheduled. So pretty self-explanatory there, but you'll see here in this drop down, it's the exact same idea as after form is completed. It's going to ask you, which scheduler are we looking at here in this particular workflow? And I only have one right now, which is my 30-minute consultation, so I can select that. If I had 3 or 4 different schedulers in this workflow, I could say after this scheduler or after this scheduler, I could do that, but there's only one, so that's why it shows up in the dropdown. So I'm very specific here on when I want that intake questionnaire to go out to the client. Then create to do, and we're going to do this next week actually, but this is something that I have in my workflow process. I want to create a to do to prepare for the consultation with the client 1 day before an appointment start time. Maybe this is a little bit extra for some people. They might say, I don't really need to know or prepare for something or anything like that. This might be extra, but it can help you understand just some common uses for this. So what I have here is I'm creating a task for myself to prepare for the consultation with the client. We talked about to-dos yesterday, but I'm preparing for this 1 day before an appointment start time, and it's going to look at when they booked. So 24 hours before that, it's going to send me a little email. I don't know if I have email selected. If I choose that, it's going to send me an email saying, hey, prepare for the consultation because it's coming up in a day. So that's how you can kind of use that if you want to. So that's all based off of an appointment. And then the last one is after appointment has ended. So here, something that I will always tell people when they're doing after an appointment is ended is always give yourself buffer space. What you don't want to do is this. If I set this to 0 hours, or I could say 0 days after an appointment has ended, and I want to send out this meeting follow-up email, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to have I'm going to have a meeting with this person from 1 to 2 o'clock. The scheduler and this workflow is going to see 2 o'clock is when this ends. If I stay with the client until 2:10, this email is still going to go out. It's not going to realize, oh, I'm still in this meeting, so hold off for a second. It's going to send. I could be in this meeting with somebody and they get an email from me while I'm standing there and it says, hey, I loved chatting with you today. Here's a proposal. So you don't want to do that. I highly recommend not putting immediately after the appointment is over, because it's not actually paying attention to real world scenarios. It's doing what you have programmed into it, not what you intend for it to do. So here, a good rule of thumb, just give yourself maybe 2 hours or something like that. It doesn't have to be 2, but just give yourself some time after the appointment is over. So that way, just in case it goes long, you have that safety net there. You can always put an approval button on there if you want to, maybe to add something in there about the appointment, like maybe you met their dog or something, and so you want to add something fun in the email. That's going to be how you can use this effectively, but it's all based on that 30-minute consultation. So that's how you can use this. And here's some kind of common scenarios there of how you can use an appointment that's in the workflow and use things to fire based off of the appointment. Now, one other thing that I want to mention about schedulers, actually, there's 2 other things. The one thing I want to mention here is you should not be sending out appointment reminders in your workflow. There are many times where I've seen people put appointment reminders in their workflow, and what ends up happening is they put appointment smart fields in their actual email, and it's not reading that particular consultation or whatever the scheduler is, and all of those smart fields are blank. Appointment reminders, we talked about this, I think it was maybe on our second session. Appointment reminders should always be set up in the scheduler itself down here in the notification section. So if you want to send something out a day before their consultation or an hour before, that should not be in your workflow, because those appointment smart fields are not going to work in there. If you add in your appointment reminders in the template itself, now it can read those appointment smart fields and plug in the right data, and it works the same way. It's still automation. There's a big misconception that all automation happens in a workflow, and that is not true. If you add that into this settings here, it's still going to go out, much like payment reminders do. If you have a payment schedule in a workflow, you don't need to put those as workflow actions. Those are inside of the payment schedule itself or inside the scheduler template itself. Same with confirmation emails. What you don't want to do is come into the workflow here, and once they book an appointment, send out a confirmation email to the client saying, here's your time. That's all happening in the scheduler. So keep all of that over there. Now, if you want to send something after the appointment has ended, now you have to do that in the workflow. We don't have anything in the scheduler template that can send something out after that appointment. That's workflow related. But the reminders that an appointment is coming up, that should be contained in the scheduler there. So that's one thing that I wanted to talk about with those scheduler triggers. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, and this is probably going to be very relatable to people who are in the coaching industry, a lot of people who have, and we talked about this week 1, if you have a scheduler and lead capture together outside of Dubsado, meaning it's on your website or you have this on your Instagram bio and someone can click on there and book an appointment and fill out a lead capture, you cannot use workflow triggers. You cannot use scheduler or appointment triggers to watch something that's outside of the platform. It's the same idea with after form is completed and the lead capture. It cannot see something that is considered outside of the system. You can only use these triggers if it's being sent out in the workflow. So what does that mean? You might have to make a process change. You might say, I absolutely need those scheduler triggers. And so maybe what you do instead is have them fill out a lead capture only. And then as soon as they fill out that lead capture, the moment that kicks in, you send an email to them with your scheduler in the workflow. Similar to this scenario here, now because it's in the workflow, I can use any trigger that I want to there. But what you can't do is if it's embedded on your website or outside of Dubsado, the workflow can't see that appointment. It's outside of the system. So that's very important to pay attention to. A lot of coaches do it this way where you have your availability on your website. But just some quick business advice. You actually, if you think about this like theoretically, I know automation is kind of sexy and everybody loves it, but if you have a scheduler and a lead capture form on your website and someone books a discovery call with you, technically you don't want something to go out immediately once their appointment is over. Why? Because you don't even know if they're going to want to move forward from this discovery call. Some people think to themselves, well, once the appointment's over, I want this to go out automatically, but you don't even know if you want that to happen because maybe during the discovery call, they say, let me think about it, or maybe they do want to move forward. So in reality, you actually don't even want this to happen where something immediately goes out once that appointment is over, because you don't know what the outcome of that discovery call is even going to be. So what I recommend doing if you don't want to change this process at all is don't have a workflow that's even attached there. What you should do is just have the scheduler there with the lead capture, and then based off of that consultation, if they want to move forward, now go into their project and just start the first phase of your workflow, because now you know they want to move forward. If they don't want to move forward, maybe you have another workflow phase that is, hey, I'm sorry that we're not going to be able to work together. Here's some recommendations for you. Maybe I want to start that workflow instead. So just from a back end idea of this, what I would do if you still want to keep this is just maybe not apply a default workflow there if you're needing it to watch the appointment, and maybe just apply it manually if you want to. That's always an option there based off of how the consultation goes. So that's how the scheduler triggers work there. Now let's move on to project dates. I just want to check the time here. Okay, perfect. So we're making good time. Project date triggers. So now we're looking at things that are based off of the project date. You've heard me talk about it before, but when someone is booking on the scheduler, that is not considered the project date. That is considered an appointment date. A good analogy I like to use is if you're having surgery, your surgery date is your project date. But if you have like a pre-op appointment or a post-op, those are what the scheduler are really good for. Now you can use the scheduler for, mini sessions and different things like that. I won't deep dive into that today, but project dates are something different than if someone is booking an appointment with you. Those are two separate things. So with the project date triggers, this is looking at the date of the actual project. So let me show you where that's at. Underneath project, and let me click into one of these projects here. Right up here at the top, this is the project date. This is what the workflow can look at. So when I'm here on this slide, you can have something go out before the project start date or after the project start date, or before the project end date or after the project end date. It can look at both of these dates separately, and you can send something out on either side of those dates. For example, let's say I'm running a conference and it goes from 7/9 to 7/17. If I want to send something out on either side of July 9th, I could do that, or on either side of the 17th, I can do that if it's over a long period of time. I have a little note over here. If your project date is only one day, so let's say you're a photographer or you're doing like a wedding or something like that, you can use any of these 4 triggers and it all works the exact same because it's only looking at one date. So if you're kind of confused about what if I only have one date, all of these triggers will work the exact same. You don't really have to pay attention too much to that because it's all looking at one date there. So that's how the project date triggers work. Something that I do want to show you here, because I want to give some real world scenarios just to spark your creativity on what you could do. So I have a little workflow here that explains kind of a good way you can think about this. So let's say that I'm running a conference like that same idea, 7/9 to 7/17. So the first thing I could do is 2 weeks before the project start date. So 2 weeks before that conference, I could send out like a registration sign up email saying, hey, it's time to sign up for the registration to get early bird pricing. I'd probably do that way before 2 weeks now that I'm thinking about it, but you get the idea. So in here, 2 weeks before that start date, I could send out maybe like a registration sign up email. Then what I could do is maybe 3 days after that project start date, so the conference has been going on for a few days, what I could do is do like a conference check-in. We're just a few days into the conference. I hope you are really enjoying yourself. If you have anything you need, please don't hesitate to reach out. So I'm looking at that start date, and then 3 days after we're into that conference, now I want to send out maybe like a checking in to see how they're doing. Now, 2 days before the end date. So now we're getting to the end of the conference. 2 days before that conference is ending, maybe I want to say we only have a few days left of the conference. Click on this link to get access to your offboarding checklist. Maybe it's like a hyperlink that I put in there to something that's outside of Dubsado maybe, but I could send this out 2 days before that conference is going to end. And then the last thing would be once the conference is over, so after project end date, maybe 3 days after, I could send something out that says, we hope you had an incredible time at the conference. Could you please fill out a review on Google of how you think everything went? So that's just a real practical scenario of how you can use project dates. Looking at 2 separate dates, you could have something go out on either side of those dates. So hopefully that makes sense on using those effectively. And then the last thing is just what we call general triggers. There's not really a specific name for them. And there's 2 that we haven't discussed yet. The first one is after workflow has started. This is all relative to when the workflow gets applied to the project. That's very important. It's once the workflow gets added into that project. So when we're looking at something like this, where once that lead capture form gets filled out and the project gets created, it's going to add that workflow in there, and that's the start time. So when we're thinking about like a lead capture form getting filled out, and let's say they fill out a lead capture and I want this to happen, after workflow started is a great trigger for that, because a good way to frame it is that the lead capture form getting submitted is actually starting your workflow. So if you use after workflow started, let me go back to one of my examples here. I believe it was on this one maybe, or this one. Let me see here. Which one was it that I had this on here? Yeah, so after form is not completed. So as you can see here, I have send out the catering proposal immediately after the workflow has started. So what that means is, let's say they fill out a lead capture form, and the very first thing in my workflow is a catering proposal goes out to them. That means that as soon as that lead capture form gets filled out, it is kicking this off and sending it. So it's all related to when the workflow gets applied, whether you apply that workflow manually or you have a public proposal or a lead capture that's automatically starting that workflow. It's all the same thing. It's all once it gets applied to that project. So hopefully that makes sense on when that triggers. And then I have a key here. This is the trigger you will use on the first actions in your workflow anytime you want to count forward from when the workflow starts. So that's how that one works. And then the last one, after all previous actions are complete. This is by far the most overused, I would say, trigger when people should not be using this trigger. And I'll show you why here in a second, but it makes me laugh. Relative to when all preceding actions, that means everything that's above it gets completed, including any to-dos, anything like that. Everything above it has to be completed. If not, then it's not going to run. This trigger should only be used if no other trigger is a better fit. Here's what I mean by that. I want to be super clear when I say this. I am not saying don't use this trigger, because you will have to use this trigger at some point. I've been on the phone with people and they'll say, you said in another webinar to never use this trigger. No, you will need to use this trigger, but let me explain what I mean by that. You only want to use this trigger if there's nothing else better that fits for what you're trying to do. This is kind of like what I like to call a last resort trigger. If nothing else fits, This will make more sense on Monday when we talk about translating your process into Dubsado. But the goal is to find the trigger that is the most precise to exactly when you want it to go out. This is where that traffic light analogy that I had at the beginning really comes into play. Let me show you an example of what this looks like. So if I have a workflow set up and it looks like this here. So I have a catering proposal that's going out after the workflow starts. So far, so good. Then I have send contract immediately after all previous actions are complete. Then I have send primary invoice immediately after all previous actions are complete. Then I have send email, the client portal welcome immediately after all previous actions are complete. There's a lot of people that I've talked to that are kind of like the after all previous actions are complete addicts. They just throw it on everything. And what they're thinking to themselves is, well, once they get done with the proposal, then it's going to send out the contract. And once they get done with the contract, it's going to send out the invoice. And then once they pay, it's going to send out the welcome email. Theoretically, what you're wanting it to do, that makes sense. But what you programmed into it is not what you're thinking you want it to do. Again, the workflow is going to do what you program into it, not what you're intending for it to do necessarily. So this right here is going to lead into that train wreck where it's going to send out a proposal, send out a contract, send out an invoice, send out the welcome onboarding email, all in kind of a domino fashion. So this right here, this is a misuse of using this trigger. What you should be doing is something like this in this scenario. Just by making a few slight adjustments on your traffic lights, now it is send out the catering proposal. Only once they complete that proposal is the contract going to go out. Only once they sign that contract is the invoice going to go out. And only once they pay their invoice is the welcome onboarding email going to go out. All the actions are the exact same. That's why I said workflow actions are important, but workflow triggers are so much more important, because just by changing the triggers on this, it is a completely different client experience. Way different. You will probably keep your client if you have it set up this way. If you have it set up the other way, they're going to be like, I just got 4 emails and I haven't even opened the proposal yet. So that's why workflow triggers are so important. And you want to really try to figure out which one works the best for this. Don't just go in and just throw in a trigger. Look over the triggers and say, okay, when do I specifically want this to go out? Not just generalize it. Intentionality is key with this.